Today, we're going to focus on Universalism, and it's important to know that most ministers take a semester or even a year-long course on Unitarian Universalist history and polity. And, we're just going to scratch the surface of our history. And so one of my main and favorite sources for today is David E. Bumbaugh's book, Unitarian Universalism, A Narrative History. And what I like about his work is that it's a true narrative history. And I could sit here and talk to you all about all the names and the dates and the numbers, and you would probably fall asleep. I would probably fall asleep. But stories about the really interesting parts of our history, that will hopefully keep you awake. And so I'm only going to be discussing Universalism here in America, and the same next month with Unitarianism. There's so much more that happened in Europe, but we're going to talk here about America. So the first Universalist church in North America was the Independent Church of Christ in Gloucester, Massachusetts. This church was formed by 16 members from First Parish after they were suspended for not attending services. Back then, it was really important you were at service. They took attendance, and if you weren't there, you got kicked out. On Christmas Day, 1780, John Murray preached the first sermon, and there were 31 men, 30 women, and one of the people present was a former slave named Gloucester Dalton. Now, here's the thing. They started their own church. Cool. But they still had to pay taxes to support the church they left. Not as cool. So as we will start to see, one of our defining traits in both of our ancestor denominations, they simply said no. They just refused to pay. Now, the town seized and sold all the property of the new church. Their reasoning? Pretty simple. The Independent Church of Christ was not a church because it was not incorporated and it didn't pay a minister. And it was, quote, nothing more than a collection of dissenters, according to Bumbaugh. Well, the congregation immediately convinced Murray to take a salary, which for whatever reason he didn't want to do, but did agree so that they could be a legal church. And in 1783, the Universalists sued to be free from their burden of having to pay taxes for their old church. Now, it took 3 years before they won, and this would be the first step towards a total separation of church and state in Massachusetts. Now, by 1793, there were enough Universalist congregations that they gathered in Oxford, Massachusetts for a meeting. There were 71 congregations represented, and this is considered the founding date of Universalism. So let's talk a little bit about some of the Universalist beliefs as they were being stated at the time. So 1790, Dr. Benjamin Rush, the guy who signed the Declaration of Independence, was a friend of Adams, Jefferson, and Joseph Priestley. He was the personal doctor of George Washington and became known as the father of American psychiatry. He was the author of one of the first statements of Universalist belief. He insisted that Universalism and the Republican government were part of the same unfolding process, and that, quote, social action is an inescapable consequence of the Universalist faith. Okay, so remember John Murray, minister of our first Universalist congregation. Well, he believed that Christ came to save all humanity. For him, the crucifixion was a point where the sacrifice was made to save all humanity, and the gates of hell were sealed. This is important because not everyone felt this way. Elihan Winchester was a restorationist Universalist. He believed that sinners would go to a sort of timeout after death to then be restored after a punishment. But it wasn't a case of going to hell as non-Universalists believed. It was just kind of a timeout so that you could think about what you had done, do some penance, and then go on to eternal reward. Now it's time to meet Hosea Ballou. He was 23 when he preached at the 1794 Universalist gathering and was ordained on the spot because of his preaching. Now, he was not a restorationist. He was what is known as an ultra-Universalist. He believed that sin was punished in this life by the consequences of our actions. He believed that all were saved and that all people were infinitely good. He's known as the father of Universalism. Now, he believed that since God is unlimited, God's love is also unlimited, that love embraces all. And because God is all powerful, no human could frustrate God's love or design. Ballou was also a Unitarian. He believed that if the Godhead consisted of 3 persons, each infinite, then the Godhead is infinity times 3, which is an impossible concept. For Ballou, a rational God wouldn't present as an irrational revelation. His treatise on atonement laid out that reasoning and came 15 years before the Unitarians even accepted the name as their theological position. And you can still find the Treatise of Atonement online. It was published, and within 10 years of publication, Universalists had become Unitarian in theology and committed to Ballou's rationalism. Now, you'd think that the Unitarians would embrace Universalists as friends and allies, right? Yeah, no. The Unitarians saw Universalists as coming from the wrong side of the tracks. Their ministers were itinerant instead of settled in churches. Their ordinations were irregular. Their ministers had little to no education. Their congregations were drawn from disaffected Baptists, Methodists, Quakers, and German sects, and all of those churches served lower social classes. And they attacked the doctrine of hell, which many liberal Christians saw as necessary for social order. Liberal Christians who would become the Unitarians saw early Universalism as part of the revivalist phenomenon, which of course unsettled the standing order of things in New England. So a missed opportunity. Not necessarily for consolidation or merger, but just for doing the work together. The Unitarians refused to welcome the Universalists, even though many Universalists were staunch Unitarians as well. So during this time, between 1793 and 1803, the message of Universalism began to spread. And in 1803, we have the Winchester Profession of Faith, which was created in Winchester, New Hampshire at a meeting. The profession reads as follows. We believe that the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testaments contain a revelation of the character of God and of the duty, interest, and final destination of mankind. We believe that there is one God, whose nature is love, revealed in one Lord Jesus Christ by one Holy Spirit of grace, who will finally restore the whole family of mankind to holiness and happiness. We believe that holiness and true happiness are inseparably connected, and that believers ought to be careful to maintain order and practice good works, for these things are good and profitable unto men. So this was the profession that all Universalists held. And yes, it was kind of a type of creed, but we can see here bits of what comes forward in our modern Unitarian Universalism. It will change a bit over the intervening years. But first, we're going to talk about a controversy. We're going to talk about a lot of controversies today because I find them fascinating in how they give us glimpses into how our ancestors handled conflict, change, and challenge. So first, the Restorationist controversy. So in 1819, the Universalist ministers decided it would be a fun thing to have a debate about future punishment. Hosea Ballou and Reverend Edward Turner agreed to take the two sides of the argument and generate thought and discussion among ministers. And I wonder if they realized that the Protestant Reformation began because a minister wanted to have conversations about things he saw wrong in Catholicism. Probably not. But Turner picked first, and Ballou was left to defend no punishment after death, which we assume from all the history that this was an easy assignment for him. By 1822, yes, they were still going. This became a huge conversation. If hell is off the table, how do we maintain social order? Ballou attempted to close the debate to stop the fighting, but it was too late. In 1830, there was a schism. The Massachusetts Association of Universalist Restorationists was formed and caused the separation of 12 societies from the New England Convention of Universalists. Now, the Restorationists met separately for 10 years, 1831 to 1841, and then simply faded away. Many became Unitarians because many Unitarians were Restorationists. Now, many Universalists stayed, even though they quietly held Restorationist beliefs. They just didn't feel it was important enough to separate over the issue. And later in the century, Restorationism kind of became the dominant position. So what was going on with the growth of Universalism? Well, Universalists were evangelical in nature. In 1800, there were 22 ministers. Within 20 years, they spread from urban centers to the interior and most rural areas. There were 200 societies or churches by this time. Most of them were in New England and New York. And in 1832, the American Almanac listed Universalism as the 6th largest denomination in the country with around 500,000 adherents. By 1840, they were 3% of the total population of the country, around 700,000 Universalists. However, much like now, there were a lot of people who claimed a belief in Universalism but weren't actually attending any church. Records from the denomination never counted more than 55,000 members. Now, this rapid growth stopped by 1850, and for a lot of reasons, but the decline may have been related to the growing social crisis that led to the Civil War. The focus moved from a religious agenda to social, political, and moral challenges. And we're going to talk about education now. The Universalists saw a need for schools that weren't so sectarian. They wanted schools to be open to all and to provide young people with an education devoid of sectarian indoctrination. And they also designed to provide education for girls and women. So the Universalists founded Tufts University, St. Lawrence University, Butchtel College, now Akron University, Lombard College, keep an eye on this one, Throop Institute, which is now Caltech, and they also founded theological schools, the Crane Theological School at Tufts, the St. Lawrence Theological School, and Rider Divinity School. The Universalists also formed a publishing house and had 17 periodicals by 1860. Now, social action was a huge part of the Universalist religious beliefs. They saw prison reform and the end of capital punishment as imperatives from their religious convictions. They argued, according to Bumbaugh, quote, just as nothing any human being might do could suffice to separate that person from God's love, so no act could free human beings from their obligation to offer unconditional love. Universalists saw capital punishment as failure of faith in God's ability to renew, regenerate, and reform. They argued that since God didn't give up on anyone, we should refuse to give up hope for human regeneration. And because of their theology, they were reluctant to demonize anyone. Even during the Civil War, they saw everyone involved as tangled in tragic circumstances. They urged that strident denunciations would result in only strengthening resistance. Now, this doesn't mean they weren't abolitionists. They were. In 1841, in Maine, the Universalist Association created their own abolitionist movement as they were unwelcome in the mainstream abolitionist movements. In 1843, the General Convention of Universalists declared slavery inconsistent with universalism, with justice, and with Christian love. This received wide coverage, and the Herkmeyer Journal declared Universalists were the first major denomination to take a stand on slavery. Now, just because there was a statement doesn't mean everyone agreed. The response was mixed in the denomination, as some felt this was too political and others felt that it didn't go far enough. Sound familiar? So the Universalist state conventions called for civil disobedience as a response to the fugitive slave laws. Another interesting tidbit, in 1853, the Universalists realized that slavery was only the beginning of the problem and Blacks would need help. Quote, we must conquer our miserable prejudices. 1853, my friends. Now in 1861, the Civil War begins. Universalists were strongly committed to the Union. In fact, there was no North-South split of the Universalists. 50 ministers served as chaplains in the Union Army, and the first Union casualty of war was Sumner Henry Needham. He was a Universalist killed in the Baltimore riots. So, because I don't have all day, we were going to fast forward to 1870 for the Universalists. They decided that it was time to get organized, or more organized. They pushed forward a new constitution that had a 3-level hierarchy. At the local level, there was the parish, the congregation. This congregation belonged to the state convention. The state convention was made up of ministers of churches, lay delegates from churches, and the officers of the convention. Now, they had the power to issue letters of fellowship to ministers, to ordain, and to discipline ministers. And they were charged with raising funds for the denomination, keeping statistics, maintaining and supporting Sunday school, and caring for indigent ministers. The president and secretary of each state convention and 1 minister and 2 lay people from each state served as delegates to the general convention. And the general convention held the trust funds, raised money, required reports, and adjudicated disputes between state conventions, and they served as the court of final appeal in all discipline cases. They were seen as an ecclesiastic body, as all the administrative functions were down on the state level. Now, we're going to fast forward again to the end of World War I. I warned you we would just be hitting the highlights. Anyway, war changed everything. People moved out of rural areas and many rural churches closed. Those who moved to the cities found no churches in their new communities. And since Universalists won the theological struggle with mainline Christianity, there wasn't as much hellfire and brimstone being preached. Many Universalists couldn't see a distinction between Universalism and Christianity. Now, these issues led to the church's decline. The organizational structure was simply too weak to address these issues. So this sets the stage for our merger, which we will talk about in April. And next month, I will talk to you about our Unitarian history that ran kind of parallel. But what I hope you see in this is some of those DNA threads that come forward into who we are today as Unitarian Universalists. So thank you. And I look forward to sharing more with you next month.